Thank you. So I'm Zoe Oldfield. I'm one of the ELSA collaborators. I am based at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which mainly does economic research. So as you might expect, I deal mainly with the economics data. So ELSA is quite unusual for a multidisciplinary study in that we collect a lot of detail on the on finances. Often multidisciplinary studies just might collect a summary variable, but because we've got lots of economists on the management group, we think it's quite important to get this right. So one of my tasks is to derive variables with the aim that it makes it easier for the end user to use the data. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that, and those variables and those data sets and where you'll find them. And then I'm going to also speak very briefly at the end about some of the data linkages that Brian touched upon. I'm going to just talk a few bit about those as well. So the main idea of this talk is to let you know that the variables exist, that the data sets are there. I'm going to introduce you to what they are and the information that they contain. Haven't got very long, so it's not going to be possible to cover everything that you might ever want to know about them, but hopefully I'll be able to give you an overview and it'll give you the tools to find out more that you might need to know for your specific purpose. So when you download the ELSA data, in addition to the main data that Brian talked about that contain all the CAPI interviews and the nurse data, you also get given the financial and non-financial derived variables as part of that download. You don't need to download anything separately. And the data will be in the format that you choose to download from the UK Data Service. So the way the data is organised, there's one financial and one non-financial data set for each wave. So up until wave 9, you've got 9 financial derived variable data sets and 9 non-financial derived variable data sets. The financial derived variables contain only information relating to financial variables, as you might expect. The non-financial derived variables contain other variables that us at the IFS, but also other researchers from UCL have used over the years in reports and in their research. And we make these variables available so that people don't have to reinvent the wheel every time they use the ELSA data. In both these files, there's one observation per ELSA respondent. That means that you can merge the data directly into the core data without having to do anything particularly fancy. So why do we create these derived data sets? So the ELSA questionnaire contains hundreds of questions relating to respondents' economic situation. So lots of detail about their earnings, their state benefits, their pensions, their assets, their debts. And it's spread over, the questions are spread over at least 3 of the different modules that Brian talked about. So work and pensions, income and assets, and housing. We give respondents lots of flexibility to answer the questions in the way that they want. Research has shown that the more detail you collect from respondents and the more disaggregated you collect the information, the better the quality of the data that you get out the other side. We allow respondents to keep their finances, so couples who keep their finances together are allowed to answer the questions on behalf of both of them. And those who keep them totally separate are allowed to answer separately. So the flexibility means that ultimately we get better data quality, but the downside is it makes the data quite complex. And that means that it can be quite hard to use for people who might not be familiar with this way of collecting data. So what we've done is we've combed through all of ELSA's many financial questions. We've transformed the income flows into uniform periods, i.e. weekly. So another flexibility that we offer respondents is that they can tell us their income on a weekly basis, if that makes sense to them, or a monthly basis, if that makes more sense to them, or even yearly. We have imputed amounts of income and wealth where we have incomplete or missing values. So if people say they don't know, then we don't immediately say, okay, that's fine. We say to them, well, could you tell us whether it was, for example, more than £200 or less than £200? And again, that adds another complexity into the data. But to make the end user's life easier, we've imputed values where that happens. We've added all the components together into economically meaningful aggregates like employment income, benefit income, and so on, so that you don't have to. So there is a trade-off between making the data useful and providing enough information for all users. So we don't just provide the summary variables. The summary variables are there for the average user who might just want to run a regression on health and use income as an explanatory variable. But there are equally users who might want to dig a bit deeper and look in more detail. So as well as the summary variables, we do provide all the disaggregate information as well, but it's still being converted into a version that is easier to use than the raw data. So what's actually included in the financial derived variables? So starting with the most aggregated measure, we have obviously total income. Then we split that into 7 different subcomponents. So we have employment income, self-employment income, private pension income, state pension income, state benefit income, asset income, and other income. So in the main, lots of people would just be able to use these variables. They're kind of very well-known components. It matches DGBP's measures of income. So you can just pick up those summary variables to use in your work quite easily. But if you wanted to look a bit more closely at any one of those components, each one of those 7 components has further subcomponents, which you may or may not want to use, but the information is there if you want it. So what about the wealth variables? So again, starting at the top with the most summary measure, we have total non-pension wealth. So in these financial variable files, we don't look at pension wealth at all. There are separate files for pension wealth, which have been derived for some of the waves, but not all of them. If you were interested in that, then you would best to get in contact with either me or one of the other ELSA team to talk about how, where you would find that information and how to use it, because it's quite complex. So we're dealing with just non-pension wealth. That's split into non-housing wealth and primary housing wealth, so primary housing wealth being the house that you actually live in. Non-housing wealth, it can be further subdivided into financial wealth, which is things like savings accounts and stocks and shares and so on. Physical wealth is any second homes you've got, any business wealth, any works of art, and any unusual things like that. Primary housing wealth is the value of your house, i.e. gross primary housing wealth. And also we separately collect how much debt you have, so what the value of your mortgage is. So you can look at that separately as well. And net financial wealth can be further split into financial wealth and any debt, so any loans or credit cards that you might have taken out. So important things that you'll need to remember if you want to use this data. So all income flows are measured weekly. That doesn't mean that the person was paid weekly, it just means that we've taken whatever value they gave us and made it weekly. We adjust, we provide equivalized and unequivalized measures of aggregate income. So what does this mean? So if you've got a couple, they're obviously going to need more income to get the same standard of living as a single person. So we adjust that income to take into account the size, whether they're a couple or a single person, basically, because that's what a benefit unit is. We don't do this for wealth. Equivalent scales don't exist for wealth. They don't really make sense because wealth is a more long-term measure of resources. And it's also important is that the unit of observation is the individual. So that means that in the file that you'll get, there's one observation per individual, but any measure of income that that person has relates to the benefit unit. So that means it's either their own income if they're a single person, or it's the income that they have access to as a couple, rather than divided by 2. So that's a very broad overview of the financial derived variables. What about the non-financial derived variables? So the purpose of these is to centralize the derivation of some of the more complex variables. So ELSA, because it's a longitudinal study, we have variables that have been fed forward from a previous wave. We have some quite complex measures of things like cognitive function and health and so on. So what we do is to try and reduce the duplication of effort across the research community, we derive some variables which we think, or which we've used or we think that other people might want to use, and we make those available. So that includes things like couple identifiers. So if you think about a couple, they might start off as a couple at the beginning of the wave, they might split up. So if they do, they get a different identifier, so it means that it's like a cross-wave couple ID. We've got children variables, so there's the way that we collect how many children people have is in different parts of the survey, because some of the children will be living with them, some of them won't be, so we've tried to make that a bit more straightforward. Things like family type, labour market participation, some of the summary pension variables. So as I mentioned before, we don't include a measure of pension wealth, but we do include whether you have a private pension, whether you're claiming that now, whether you're not, some summary health variables and expectations, and some expenditure variables. So that's a kind of broad overview of what we have done and the fact that these data sets exist. There's lots of more information in the documentation, so I would point you to there if you want to find out more. The documentation contains more detail on how the variables were imputed, where we have missing information, how the variables were actually derived, and how the naming conventions work. So there's lots of variables in both these files, particularly in the financial derived variables file. We've tried to keep the variables named in a way that is consistent and you can identify, which will help you identify what the variable actually means and the unit of observation. The documentation also has more detail on the way that the data are collected, because that's quite important to the structure of the data and how it was derived. And also contains some frequently asked questions which we've been asked over the years. So the documentation files, there's two basic user guides. So there's the financial derived variables user guide and the non-financial derived variables user guide. There are two Excel spreadsheets. Each of these has one row per variable, and it tells you the source variables for each of those and how each of those variables were derived. And also a more in-depth description of the way that we impute missing data. We give quite a lot of information in the data about the level of imputation that was carried out on each of the variables, so that the user can decide whether people might not agree with the way that we've done it, they might want to do it their own way, or they might not want to use imputed data at all. So we give people the flexibility to select the data in the way that they want. So moving on very briefly to data linkage. So Brian touched on this already. So Brian mentioned that the ELSA data have been linked to the NHS data, so that's things like the hospital episode statistics and the accident and emergency data. However, at the moment, the problem is that we haven't agreed onward sharing except for if people are wanting to do COVID-related research. So during COVID, there was some emergency legislation which allowed data to be shared more easily, and that legislation was used to make the linked data available via something called the Longitudinal Linkage Collaboration, or UK LLC. So that's a trusted research environment. You can apply to use the data at the moment only if you want to use do COVID-related research. And you can, it's a bit like the ONS SRS, I don't know if anyone's used that. You tunnel into it, use the data. At the moment, there's only got wave 9 and the COVID data. That's because we only have agreement to use the data for COVID. There's also environmental linkages that are available in the LLC. However, funding has been agreed to expand this to non-COVID related research, and we hope this is going to happen quite quickly over the coming months. So as well as allowing people to do non-COVID related research, we'll also be putting in all the waves of data, not just wave 9, and we're also hoping to expand the linkages to include DWP benefits data and HMRC data on employment and earnings. So that'll allow us to have a longer history for our respondents, and also provide more detail on everything that they have said. So, you know, we do collect benefits data in ELSA, but it's always useful to know whether that tallies with the administrative data and it also gives information back to 1998, so we get a much longer history without actually having to ask them. We'll also be linking to education records, although that's less relevant for ELSA given our, the age of the cohort. And separately, we're also hoping to have DWP benefits data available in the ONS SRS, as well as in this LLC platform, just to give users more flexibility, and if people are used to using the SRS, which I know a lot of people are. Okay, so that's all I really wanted to say. If anyone has any questions, please speak up. Yeah.
Are there linkages to mortality data?
So mortality data is a difficult one. That's kind of combined with the NHS digital data. So we used to always link to mortality data. We used to have an index file that's got really out of date. And the reason for that is because of the problems. I don't know if you know how difficult it is getting data out of NHS digital. So we haven't managed to update that very recently. But we are working on it hard.